Moving forward to item number 19, conference reports. We have two of them. We'll start with, are these going to be PowerPoint or anything? Okay, so we're going to go with Vice Chair Brittany Cummins, and then Board Member Lisa Cummins. You will be on deck for your report. Is that correct?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay, when you turn your mic on, then I'll. Well, let's do Lisa. Let's do Board Member Cummins first while you're bringing yours up. So, Board Member Cummins, will you turn your mic on? I don't know who will get ready. Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, so because I wasn't prepared with my notes, they're all at home, I'm going to read what so I was given the opportunity to go to the first ever National Data Quality Campaign Summit. And there was maybe 50, 60 people there from across the nation, about several, I would say about 23, 25 states were represented, Utah being one of them. They asked us not to tweet out or send any of their information. They wanted it, because this was the first time, they wanted to make sure it was really good, and so I still have some of that at home, and there's still questions there. The one thing I learned, everybody knows how big on data safety I am. The one thing that concerned me, let me start with my concern, was that that FERPA, though it was talked about, I didn't feel that there was enough concern. It was the only term I can think of is flippant. All the parents just had to do was sign a waiver, and I think Utah is really good at informing and should do better at informing parents on where data is going and what data is being collected, and I'm really proud of what Utah is doing in that regard. But the way it was approached with these programs was that all they needed to do to gather student data was to have a parent waiver, and that was concerning. But however, the other things that were discussed was really when we talk about data, what to get to the nitty-gritty, what kind of questions do we need to ask? The more specific questions, the better data results we'll get. And that's true on anything, and I concurred with that. The collecting and data I've shared, one quote that was shared: if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough, and neither does anyone else. That was a quote contributed by Albert Einstein. And so the biggest question of the attendees was, what is it that we don't know that we don't know? And that was true. That was also thought of by other state legislators that were there at the meeting as well. The message, or the goal rather, was to think of ways to have citizens, shareholders, and ourselves ask what data you wanted gathered and who to trust, how to trust that data once you have it. The one answer, or one question that was not addressed was, and I think this is really big of Utah citizens, is do we trust the data gatherers? Are we trusting the people like ourselves? Does the public trust us? Are we doing what we say to the public that we're going to do? Are we delivering those results that we are hoping for? And so I think more than just trusting the data is to trust who is asking for that data, and how do we get the public to trust a government entity when we've been, and I would say the governed, or the people, feel that there's so much mistrust on so many different levels. How do we establish that? And all I can say is, going back to constitutional principles and understanding where the line is of, as elected officials and as government entities, that we are not to cross with the public trust. And I think we've lost that. One thing another thing that was taught was that behind every data point, there is a student, a teacher, or a community and their story. You know, we need to be careful with this data and share the successes or not. Sometimes, you know, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And sometimes that data gathering should be a private thing just for that student and that family. So that's something to think about. Effective communication is more than a press release. Know your audience and don't talk down to them. We should not use, I think earlier today we had Spencer Stokes ask Scott Jones how many acronyms, what they all meant. We need to stop using acronyms and really spell out the programs that we're talking about. Show that the data is a toolkit and not a replacement for a policy or teaching best practice. That's highly important. Everybody likes data, right? Even the teachers, and they use it to collaborate and to make good decisions for their classrooms. We need to address teacher concerns about the added burden of collecting data. Are we asking too much of our teachers to input, and how many reports and evaluations, you know, they're doing? I mean, sometimes it can just be overburdening. So I think the more specific we get on the questions from the data we want, the better, and the less time that we'll take for that consumption. They say that nationally 91% of the parents want data. But again, I think that's more of a local control thing, and I don't think, you know, how far does that data need to go up? I believe it stays with the teacher and the parent in the classroom. They talked about report cards and how specific do we want to get on report cards. So we talked about our strategic plan and our state plan. What do our state report cards look like? You know, what kind of data are we gathering there? Do we want to add more data? What do we want to highlight? Accountability, to highlight success. Have we limited our ELAs and what they have achieved, even if their accountability score is D or F? Are we placing on there for the community to show what their successes are? And are we highlighting that as opposed to highlighting the letter grade? So that was a kind of a flip in thinking. They talked about 628 bills, both in 48 states and in Congress, are being presented right now with the intent to safeguard data. So that's a lot of safety on the data. People should not hear data for the first time if there's a crisis. We need to say, okay, this is what we're expecting, or this is what we're hoping, and to say if it's wrong, okay, what did we not expect? Were we not asking the right questions? So really, it's all about being very, very specific and pinpoint exactly what we're looking for, and then prepare for either good results or bad results, and not be shocked by it. Does that make sense? We need to communicate more and not less, and I agree with all of that. So, yeah, just a lot of becoming better at what we're doing on the collecting of data. So, is any other questions?
Yeah, I've got one. I'm watching to see if anyone jumps up. I'm glad that you went to that conference, because it is clear that data is important to you, mm-hmm. and it's important to all aspects of education. But I'm curious, at this particular conference, did you come away with any proposed betterments to our safety processes? Or sometimes when I go to a conference, I'm going, oh, we do that, or we do that better than you're doing it. Some confidences in what we're presently doing. Was there any solutions kind of things at this conference? I know there's we had staff. I believe we had quite a bit of staff there, or a little bit of staff.
There was,
Two or three other.
I was the only one there I didn't see any staff that I recognized. So if there were staff, please let me know, because I wasn't approached or saw
Okay.
anybody that I recognized. There were specific programs, there were breakout sessions. I mean, this was a 24-hour conference. A lot of generalities in the main conferences where everyone is gathered. In the breakout sessions, there was talks of different programs that have gone on around the country. There was talks about teacher shortages. The teacher shortage, specifically addressing the need for minority teachers. While Utah does not have a huge minority population, they do point out that nationally, the population is at 51% of students are now, the minority students are the majority, where only 20% of the teachers are minority. And so there's an imbalance, if you will, there. But I think that will fix itself as these children grow up and, start to take the jobs that we hold now. One thing, let's see, they talked about teacher licenses, degrees in process. One thing I did like, she talked about instead of, and I'm referring to Dr. Alice Ginsberg, who is from a new program called Branch Alliance for Educator Diversity. She said she'd like to see a more scaffolding approach instead of student teaching at the end of a program, to have student teaching in the classroom throughout the whole process, which I thought was a great idea, so that nobody's shocked after graduating what it's like to be teaching in the classroom. I thought that was a great idea, so that they have early practice.
Let me throw one other quick thing in there
Sure.
that might steer you into a really good place as we kind of wrap this up a little bit. You mentioned something about communication more instead of less. Is this how you use your data to tell the story, tell the whole story, and what was meant by on the communication side?
That wasn't made clear. It was very general. That was
okay.
one of those general discussions. And so it's going to depend on each state what that discussion looks like. What is it that our state board wants to convey to the public? What is it that, goes
Okay.
along with our state strategic plan? What is it that we want to...
And how data is related to
and
that
how's
communication?
related,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Mhm.
That answers that. It sounds like you had a good time.
It was jam-packed, so yes.
Well, that's good. Any other questions? Board Member Eby?
I'm sorry, where did you go and where was this again? I didn't catch that.
So it was the data quality campaign summit, and it was held in Phoenix, Arizona.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Board Member, or Vice Chair Brittany Cummins, on your report.
Okay. I have pictures, but for time, I didn't pop them up. UVU sponsored this activity, and they actually had a photographer go with us, and so there's thousands of pictures of the time that we spent there. So UVU organized a Finland education exploration, and the purpose of the trip was Parker Fossen has been working really hard at looking at, he's the dean, of the College of Education at Utah Valley University. And he's been looking at innovating teacher preparation in such a way where teachers have more clinical experience during their preparation time and what that might mean for student outcomes. And so he organized this trip, and he invited those who have been participating with NTEP, as well as other education preparation programs in Utah. They had some local board members from Washington County School District and some district administrators, as well as a couple of people that joined us from Washington State. And the purpose of the trip really was to say, okay, let's do this deep dive into their education prep programs as well as their education prep schools, which are associated with their programs. And I'll talk about that in a second. And so the observations that these come from kind of, we met each day with the education prep programs. We met with the director of their education preparation school, so it's a practice school, and then we met as a team, a full team, to kind of discuss what we observed and what we think might be something that we can bring to Utah. So this is a list of some of the general observations that we saw in our time there. Finland has a significant culture of trust, all the way from their legislative bodies down to their classrooms. It's a culture of trust in every direction. Their students have a lot of time to play. There's autonomy for educators. They have national standards, which we would equate to our statewide core standards. But ingrained or embedded into their standards is certain expectations for teachers to fulfill. So they adopt their standards every 10 years, I believe, and it's the whole thing. They have this book. You can buy it for $50 online if you're interested. So they have their standard, and it's the whole thing. Every grade level, every content area, they change at one time, or they update at one time. And embedded in those are specific tasks for teachers to accomplish as part of their rollout cycle. They're consistent. Like I said, they only do it every 10 years, and they maintain those for 10 years. And then embedded in their standards is also a grading rubric for their primary grades. So if you want to get what 1 through 8 is their grading scale. If you want to get an 8, this is what an 8 looks like. And so it basically is that way of establishing the standards. So similar, very similar to a standards-based grading system. And so here's, if you want an A, here are the standards that you have to fulfill. They only have one high-stakes standardized assessment given at the end of high school, and it's called their matriculation exam. And it's high stakes for the student. The teaching schools are associated with each education preparation program. And so you have your university, and then you have a school associated with it. And all of the students who are in their preparation program spend time at different increments in this teaching school. Their programs, their education prep programs, have very high application numbers in respect to the number of openings, and the number of openings in their education preparation programs are actually controlled by the government. Their education preparation program is a 5-year program. Each year is dedicated to education preparation. They do not have general requirements in college. I thought that was fascinating. And so you get into college year 1, and you are learning about becoming an educator. And they have practicum experience embedded into that program beginning in year 1. They have a significant number of hours of clinical experience beginning in the first year, and they have a research component that's required for every one of those prospective educators. We also spend a lot of time looking at their special education program, and they have flexible Tier 2 supports for all students, including students with disabilities and students learning Finnish as a second language. So their language learning programs and their special education programs are somewhat blurred. They're not there's not hard lines drawn around those. Students learning Finnish as a second language receive a full year of language immersion that doesn't require students to advance a grade level. So as we spent that time, here's some of the possible policy initiatives that we could consider here, as well as some things that the education preparation programs are engaged in as well. Offer a 5-year master's program with increased clinical experience and research opportunities. And Parker Fossen is very excited about this possibility and looking at some pilots of what they could do. He even talked about the concept of hijacking some of the general curriculum at a university and saying, okay, so if you have to take math as a college requirement, can we hijack some of that time that you're in that math core and use some of it to give you some experience teaching, what it would be like to be an elementary math teacher. And so they're looking at some innovative ways to give people from year one the opportunity to be in classrooms and to begin having conversations in regard to their desired profession. Looking into the possibility of using some of the general education requirements to allow university students to access to clinical experience and education concepts early in their university experience. Consider what special education training and understanding would be beneficial for all pre-service educators. And so it's that concept of how much special education communication takes place between those who are certified special educators and then a regular classroom teacher, and how do you bridge those communications and services as you look to be more flexible in your supports for students. And that goes to the next, which is flexible Tier 2 supports for all struggling students, including students with disabilities. Flexibility and time to allow students acquiring English language skills time to prepare for rigorous classroom experience. And this is one concept that I thought was very interesting as we look at different possibilities. So currently a student coming as a refugee who is aged into their junior year will be placed in their junior year, and they basically have 2 years to figure out how to prepare themselves for their next step. And that's a lot if you're learning another language and you're trying to catch up academically. And so they have a lot of flexibility in that time that is given to students. And so could we look at different options of how that flexibility could be provided for students as they come into the country or learning a different language and then prepare themselves to participate in rigorous core content. One of the interesting things that they did there is they actually have language opportunities for students, and then they have access to core content in their home language. And so there's a lot of supports for those students to receive instruction, but also to be learning Finnish. And I thought it kind of funny. I mean, you go to these countries where people speak 4 or 5 languages fluently, without batting an eye. And they said, yeah, sometimes we waive the requirement that they learn Swedish as well, and so I was just like, well, that's very kind of you. And so also one of the things that are a possibility is emphasizing the importance of downtime for students could be a possibility here, as well as emphasis on standards-based grading, which focuses on the core standards that we have established. And so it really was a great opportunity to look as a group to look at all of those different aspects of the preparation for educators, as well as some of the opportunities that they have seen.
Okay. Board member comments here. Board member Reby.
So I've heard that the Finnish schools are really amazing and they are doing incredible things. But as I look at this, and I realize their country is a lot smaller than ours is, so how would they deal with different LEAs and charter schools and private schools and different licensing for different parts of the country, or is it just one school district?
Go ahead.
It is not one school district. So it would be similar, if you look at Finland as a state, it would be similar. So they have their federal government, but then they have municipalities, which would be similar to our district, but their municipalities are not just established to oversee education. So their municipality receives money from their federal government, which would be equated to our state government. They receive money, but then they have to allocate that for social services, healthcare, education, and all those things. And so each municipality does make specific decisions for their system, their community, and how they're done. So it would be similar to a district.
So are their private schools held to the same standard as their public schools?
They do have private schools, but we didn't get into that conversation.
Go ahead.
How about charter schools? Do they do that too?
I actually had the opportunity to meet with private principals a couple of years ago in convening in Paris, where we were talking about our dual language immersion. And the private principals said that they actually receive some money somehow, but they are held to the same standards. So they use the same national or federal, whatever you call it, in standards, and They have some variance on some things, but their privates sound more like our charters, but they're privately funded.
So would they have like an LEA-specific license? And, I mean, it looks great, but for the options we want and how we want so much choice in our schools, they don't seem like they give as much choice. It seems like they are.
Yeah, and private teachers use the same teachers
Yeah.
from that same
Yeah.
pool.
And so the intent of going wasn't like, hey, let's replicate the Finnish system here. There isn't a way to say plunk, plunk. And if you talk to any person in Finland, they would say, you'd be crazy to do so, right? They're extremely humble about their system and what they're accomplishing. What UVU was really intrigued about is what can we learn from this model? Because there's a lot we can't do. We can't get rid of general education at the university level.
I like the clinical experience and research
Exactly.
opportunities, though.
Exactly. And so what are those points where we can pull from that and say, wow, that is awesome. What could we do? And so we were looking at, could we offer this idea of a 5-year master's, similar to like a business master's, that you can get your bachelor's and master's all at the same time, and you offer this program where people can go through and they have clinical experiences from day one. And so this is still just in the beginning phases of exploration, but you could offer that master's program where you begin in year 1, you have research opportunities, clinical from the very first year, but he's also looking at, obviously you can't do that wholesale. You can still offer the 4-year bachelor's, but he's trying to look at ways to get teachers into the classrooms from day 1 of their university experience. And so he's saying, what's working there and what are the good ideas that we can pull? We can't replicate it entirely because it's different. But we can look at, that is something we can do, and we can do it well. He's even looking at the concept of creating a teaching school that's associated with UVU, and looking at that concept where there's this relationship between a school and the university, and they're in the school, they're out of the school, they're having a lot of conversations. The people who are in their education programs each take, so it scaffolds up. So you go in, you observe, but then there's always feedback, so that they go in pairs. They go in, they observe, they come out, they speak to one another about what did we see, what did we do. They speak to the teacher that they were in the classroom observing, and then they go back to their university support and they speak to them. And so that it's this culture of feedback that Superintendent Dixon always talks about. It's embedded into their program from day 1 of what are you observing, what are you learning, and then how do you practice that. And so those are some things that can very easily be adapted into Utah programs.
So we are moving to LEA-specific licenses, and that's increasing, and this looks like it's the opposite. If an LEA-specific is just going to start in the classroom, 'cause that's increasing. And so this is kind of opposite of that. So that just leaves me a little curious, like.
Our education preparation programs aren't going away, and how do we improve them? How do we make them better? We're not moving towards LEA specific. That is something that has been there and will be there to offer that flexibility. But how do we have, most of our educators come through education prep programs through universities. How do we make those great? And so how do we pull from those great experiences that other places are having, and how do we make them better? And so there's some really exciting opportunity in some of the things that we saw and that are really being taken up by that group who was called NTEP, but now it's called UTEP. So.
And I think this is really good timing to get this kind of little bit of a report tomorrow in our work session. We're going to see some data on what's happening and with preparation, how, we're going to talk about, there'll be a report on teachers and the teachers that are staying, what percentage of this and that, and it's all about retention. And of course, it's about attracting teachers, having a process that will push the water clear it into the role where they leave a program with confidence of going into a classroom and teaching. And UVU, their experience here was to, of course, witness and get a feel hands-on for what's happening there, but also just take the good stuff, not really a cut and paste, but learn, okay, with what they're doing here, what do we bring back into the state of Utah, specifically to UVU, but I believe it'll make a better conversation for these universities and their programs moving forward of how do we resolve this issue. So I think UVU is pretty excited. Oh, sorry, there you go.
I'd like to see how we could legislate the importance of downtime for our students. I mean, we have added more content, and we could say, like, okay, we're going to have playtime period, and we're going to emphasize a half an hour of playtime in every school because we're trying to do that with computer science. So
Well, we
Bring
now have
back
a handful.
recess and-
yeah, we now have a handful of advocates of what is the benefit of that from this experience.
mhm.
And there's quite a few takeaways, and I think you did a pretty good job, from what I heard from UVU, of representing some of their takeaways also. Go ahead, you're still presenting.
Just as far as takeaways and things that we can actually move forward with, I did share these things with the Eliminating Barriers Task Force, and one of the items that they could look at, it would be the some of the roadblocks for our English language learners that were interesting to observe. And so how do we move forward in eliminating some of the roadblocks so that English language learners can be more successful as they come? So.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other questions. Thanks for that report.